This is Jean Gersbach, and Jean's a nurse like me, and that's where we met at the Sane. We were colleagues, and we both come from very big on nursing families. Three of my siblings are nurses, and how many of yours? Three. So we've got 4 nurses each in our families. I'll hand over to you now, Jean. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, Dath asked me if I would share my testimony this morning, and does involve the whole forgiveness thing. So I'm sure many of you will know a little at least of my story, but just for those who may not have heard it, I just thought I'd give a very brief overview. So basically, back in 2003, my husband Lance and my 2 daughters and I were asked to go and serve in mission in the Solomon Islands. On the island of Malta, we were to go to Artawifi. Any one of you who know Artawifi, we have an Adventist hospital there, and Artawifi is very, very isolated. There are no roads, or there were no roads, there were no telephones, no shops, so it was a very different experience. Having said that, we settled in fairly quickly and we were enjoying our time. The children loved it, they'd made friends, so we were happy. And then came May 18. The day started out totally normally. It was just like any other day, and I remember Lance taking my hand in bed and he just said to me, I was going through the different things that he had planned for the day, and I told him what I had planned. But little did I realise, of course, that that would be our last morning together, because it was just some 8 hours later that he was murdered. Brutally murdered, he was beheaded, whilst working for the community he'd come to serve. I'm a Christian, and some people have suggested to me that as a Christian you don't have the same pain or the same anguish that perhaps others might. I can't talk for others, but I can tell you the pain was real, and at times, if I'm honest, it felt unbearable. The question, of course, came to me, well, where on earth is God? Why would a loving God allow such trauma and such pain, particularly in the lives of my young daughters? It made no sense. And it was probably then that my journey toward forgiveness really started. About 10 months after the murder, there was a trial held on Malta, and I went back for that trial. And as I sat in that makeshift courtroom, I looked into the eyes of the 2 men who were accused of murdering Lance. Video footage was then shown to the court of Lance's mutilated body. Up until that time, I'd never been allowed to see him. So that was the first time. It was horrific. As I contemplated what I saw, an incredible anger rose up within me. I felt hatred, I felt disdain, and I wanted them to know how much I despised them. In the midst of that intense emotion, a Bible text flashed into my mind. Don't insist on getting even, don't seek revenge. It is mine to avenge, said the Lord. It seemed ridiculous, incongruous, really. And yet the message was clear. Don't seek revenge. Vengeance is mine. I will repay. And you know, to be honest, I was really afraid to let go of those feelings of anger, because I somehow felt that if I just held on to them, but perhaps those who had hurt us so deeply were more likely to be punished. Well, in my innocence or naivety, I really believed that justice would happen in that courtroom. I reasoned God places enormous value on human life, and he does. He would see that justice was done. However, that didn't happen. Both men were acquitted, a subsequent appeal was dismissed, and the case was closed and remains unsolved to this day. So, where was God? Well, trouble for me nearly always makes me turn to God. However, no longer was I going to be satisfied with a superficial belief in God. No longer was I going to rely on family, friends, the pastor, the church. I didn't care who it was or what they said. This had to be my faith and my belief. If God was real, I needed to find that out for myself. And so the journey began. Well, it's been a long journey, and one that I think is still in progress. but I have learned a number of things. I've learned that God doesn't always explain himself. He may not reveal his plan, but he has revealed himself in Jesus. I've learned that God's promises are real and binding, and that they take eternity into perspective. I've learned that God alone is my refuge, and that when nothing else makes sense, God is there. And you know, it is hard to trust, or for me, it's been hard to trust God during the really tough times. But I've learned that trust in the end really comes down to believing that God is good even when life is really, really hard. Well, over the ensuing months, my faith in God did deepen. But it didn't deepen because of any effort. It really came down to the people who showed love and kindness. Receiving a letter, an unexpected letter, receiving cards, visitors that would turn up on days that I was feeling really, really low. A hug, the simplest of things. And I just want you to remember that those things that we often take for granted actually are ways that God works through us to bring hope to those who are struggling. However, while my faith in God was getting stronger, I continued to struggle with the anger and the unfairness of what had happened. And my mind just kept going over and over it. And I was pursuing every possible means that I could to try to find justice, but it didn't happen. I felt in a way that it was like I was trapped to the crime and unable to break free. I did believe then, and I believe now, that evil cannot be condoned. We shouldn't ignore it or pretend it didn't happen. It does matter, and it matters to God. However, there is a very significant flaw in the law of revenge, because unforgiveness will never settle the score. Over time, God did gently lead me to the point where I was ready to consider forgiveness, not only intellectually, that was something that I'd done early on, but emotionally I was a long, long way behind. And he brought me to that point, and it took me nearly 4 years. In about 2006, I made contact with an anthropologist, and he told me of an impending visit to Sydney of the chairman of the Coyo Council of Chiefs. Now, this man was the most powerful man in Bush Coyo, so the Coyo people lived up in the mountains behind where we lived, and this man had an intimate knowledge of all the happenings within the community. And I was given the opportunity to have a 1-hour meeting with him. Up until that point, I'd had no opportunity to speak to anyone, so I really had no idea of why or any information about why it happened. So I drove down to Sydney and we met together. We exchanged greetings, we talked about the terrible events of that day. And toward the end of the visit, I remember saying to him, I'm at a point in my life where I have no closure. It's tormenting me. I must find closure, but I just don't know the way forward. And it's been helpful with what you've told me today, but I'm just at this block. Anyway, he looked down, and then he was looking down at the time, and he looked up and looked me in the eye, and he said, Jean, he said, there's a couple of options, but really only one option that has a way forward. You need to come back to Malaita, meet with the accused, pray with them, and offer your total forgiveness. Well, to say that I was stunned, seriously, is an understatement. I could not believe what I was hearing. I thought, how dare he say that after everything we as a family had been through, for me to go back and offer them forgiveness. They were free anyway. I have no idea what I said or if I said anything. The visit came to a close, and I started making my way back home, and it was about an hour and a half to 2-hour drive home. And his words kept going over and over in my mind. Pray with them and offer your total forgiveness. It reminded me of a book that I'd read on forgiveness by R.T. Kendall, and there was a sentence in there that I remember sticking out, and the sentence was, you must totally forgive them. If you don't forgive them, you will be in chains, but release them and you will be released. Slowly, it started to make sense. He was asking no more of me than what Jesus had done on my behalf. And when I started to consider what God had forgiven me, I realised then I could do no less. Jesus had died the cruelest of deaths so that I could have a hope and a future. He accepted and forgave me totally. No questions. I didn't earn it. I didn't deserve it. He gave me life. The love of God had meant Calvary and nothing less. And you know, the more I thought about that, the better it sounded. And I felt a sense of peace begin to wash over me. And let me assure you, the tears flowed. As I contemplated the total forgiveness option, intellectually and emotionally, I sensed a feeling of freedom. Up until that point, I certainly had been in chains. But God, in his time, had brought me to a place where I was willing and able to forgive. I wasn't in a position to return to Malaysia. It was not appropriate for me to leave the girls. So I decided I would write a letter. And in that letter, I said that I would offer my total forgiveness and that my forgiveness was based solely on what Jesus had done for me. I was in no... there is no way that I would have ever done that in my own strength. So I guess I wanted to make it clear that this story is really not about me. Anyone who knows me would know that. But I just want to reiterate that God had brought me, and it took time, 3-4 years, and yet God was patient, and I never ever felt pressured. He brought me to that decision and he carried me through until I was able to leave it totally to him. So in closing, I have no idea, even to this day, why God allowed Lance to be murdered. I don't know why he didn't answer the prayers of my 2 daughters the very night before Lance was murdered for protection. But one thing I do know. Jean, God says, my grace is sufficient. No matter what happens, my grace is all you need. And remember, my power works best in weakness. And you know, there have been so many times where I felt so weak. And at times, I couldn't trust anyone. And yet God reminds me that his grace is sufficient. It is all I need. Jesus' death on the cross is proof to me that God has a purpose in the circumstances, and that his purpose and that his plan will prevail through any circumstance. In the Garden of Gethsemane, just remember, Jesus prayed a prayer, and in that prayer he asked God, if it is possible, take this cup from me. And God answered his very own son with a no. But he did a far, far greater thing, didn't he? He raised him from the dead. Thank you.